So today we're going to make a basic rock bun, and you can see here the equipment that you're going to need. So you're going to need a sieve, mixing bowl, a smaller bowl and a fork in order to beat the egg, and you are also going to need a tablespoon. I don't actually have a tablespoon at home, so I'm using a dessert spoon, so I'm just going to add a tiny bit more to make sure I got the right weight. And you also need a baking tray. Now, like we do in school, you have the option of lining that baking tray with greaseproof paper, so that's going to save you a job with your washing up. And the other thing that you can do is just grease it with with a small amount of margarine, or you can brush a little bit of oil onto the baking tray. So the ingredients that you need for this recipe, firstly is 200 grams of self-raising flour. It's important self-raising flour, so you get a rise in the rock bun recipe from the carbon dioxide that's going to be released from the baking powder that is in the self-raising flour. We've also got caster sugar there, and we've got 75 grams of caster sugar, which is going to give sweetness and caramelise to give colour. We've also got block margarine. Now you could use any type of margarine that you have at home. Just be aware if you use a softer margarine that the dough might be a bit stickier, which is absolutely fine. You just might need to add a tiny bit more flour. You could use butter as well in the recipe if you wanted to. So we have the butter that we have 75 grams, so equal to the amount of sugar. We actually have 75 grams as well, so it's an easy recipe to remember, of raisins or sultanas. I've got sultanas there, that would be the traditional rock bun. I know many of you don't like sultanas. You could put a fresh fruit in, like chopped apple. You could also be a bit naughty and put chocolate chips, or do a combination of different flavours if you wanted to. You could be quite experimental with this recipe. I've got an egg there that we're going to beat and add to the mixture later. I've also got water ready. Now, unfortunately, at home I don't have a tablespoon, so I've got a dessert spoon. So I just had to be aware that I had to add a tiny bit more water than the recipe suggests if I'm measuring with that spoon. So the first thing to remember to do is make sure that you have set your oven, and the oven temperature should be, if you have a gas oven, about gas 7 or 220 degrees centigrade, but some of you might have fan ovens at home, and you need to reduce the temperature a little bit, probably to about 190 to 200 degrees. You have to be quite careful with the cooking time, and I'll talk to you about that in a minute, because raisins do have a habit of burning on top of the rock buns. So once we've got everything organised, we can sieve the flour. So the main reason we're sieving the flour is to add some air to the mixture, so it's for aeration. Yes, it does remove lumps. We don't really get lumps in flour. So the space between the bowl and the sieve is basically air, so we're trapping some air into the mixture. And what do gases do when they warm up? They rise. So the air in this mixture is going to help the rock buns to rise, along with the carbon dioxide that the flour is going to produce. Okay, once you've sieved the flour, we then need to add the margarine. So we're using a block margarine. Now, it's quite safe to use a table knife in your hand to cut away small pieces of the margarine. The table knife isn't going to cut your hand. Just make sure it isn't a sharp knife, because we obviously have to be quite safe. Oh, a little bit missed the bowl. Pop that in, and if you don't feel confident doing it like this, you can easily pop it on a chopping board, or you pop it on a plate in order to cut it up. But it is a good idea to get your butter or your margarine, whatever fat you're using, into slightly smaller pieces before you start to rub it into the mixture. So for the rubbing in process, what you need to do is make sure you coat all of that fat with flour. It makes it much easier to manage. And then gently with your thumb and your fingers, just squeeze out those pieces of fat until you get to a point where you can't see any large lumps of fat. So the rubbing in process is going to add additional air to the mixture. It's going to incorporate that fat all the way through the mixture. So the fat is actually coating all the flour particles, which is going to help give you a little bit of texture in your rock bun. When you are rubbing in, don't push it into the bowl hard. There's absolutely no need. Make sure you're really light with it, lifting it up to incorporate more air. Okay, and as we said before, that air is going to support the rock buns in rising. So the margarine is also going to give a little bit of colour to the recipe, and it's going to give a little bit of flavour. So if you've chosen to use butter, you'll get a slightly different flavour in your rock bun, possibly slightly different colour as well. So we're nearly rubbed in. If I actually then shake the bowl, see a few large lumps there, so I'm just going to quickly work those into the mixture. I'm just going to move that to one side, and I'm going to get my egg. I'm going to gently crack the egg into a separate bowl. So gentle tap and then break. If I did get a little bit of shell in there, the easiest way to get that shell out is by using the shell. It seems to attract itself to the shell, and that's easy to remove it, but I've been pretty good there and not got any shell into the bowl. So what I'm going to do then is beat this egg up. I'm mixing the yolk with the white. That is just going to make sure that it's evenly distributed when we pop it into the bowl. You don't have to go mad with that. You don't have to carry on doing that. Just get it all mixed together. Okay, so now I've got my egg ready, my water ready. I'm just going to add in the sugar. So the sugar is in there for sweetness. And technically what the sugar is going to do is going to caramelize and give a golden colour on the top. Obviously give some sweetness as well. It will also help to trap the air because of the fine sugar crystals. So I'm adding my sultanas, and you can see I'm just using my hands to mix them, which I don't think is an issue at the moment, but we will need to move to a wooden spoon in a minute. So then I'm going to make a well in the middle of the bowl, just for me to put my wet ingredients in. So into the well in the middle, I'm going to add my egg. So the egg goes in there. Okay, I'm then going to add, just to start with, 1 tablespoon of water. So remember I said this is a dessert spoon, so I'm going to make sure I add 1.5 to make up the fact it would be a tablespoon, which would be a bigger spoon. Okay, and then going to stir that in. Now you notice I haven't had any salt to the recipe, because nowadays we're trying to reduce the amount of salt that we add. You don't really need salt in this recipe. I think traditionally people do put salt into some cake and scone recipes, and you can see that that isn't coming together enough. So clearly the egg wasn't enough to bind it. So just to definitely make sure I get a slightly wetter dough, I'm going to add just a little bit more. That's probably 1.5 tablespoons of water that I've added to there. So when you're mixing this, just use the back of the spoon to cream it slightly against the side of the bowl, and that helps to bring it together. I still think that needs a tiny bit more water. I don't think my measuring is very good. Okay, alternatively, make them richer. I could use a little bit of milk, but that's going to add to the cost. And I'm trying to keep this as low cost as possible. I think we're just about there. A few dry bits in the bottom bowl, which we can sort out in a minute. So I'm just going to remove that from the spoon. It's absolutely no problem you getting your hands in the mixture, as long as you've followed the basic hygiene rules of washing your hands before you start to cook, and obviously during cooking if you end up licking your fingers. Okay. So the reason we've used the water in the egg is to bind the mixture. Egg is full of protein as well, and the protein in the egg is going to set, so it's going to help to set the structure of the rock buns when they are cooking. So every ingredient has a scientific reason for adding it. So I'm now going to take a small amount of dough, and they're called rock buns for a reason, because we're not putting them on there really neatly. They should look pretty rocky and pretty rustic. So I'm just grabbing not rolling into a ball. You could roll it in a ball if you want them neater and if you want them tidier, but really that isn't necessary. Okay, so you just continue getting the mixture. Gets a little bit sticky on your hands. It's absolutely fine. Okay, until you get them all onto the baking tray. So you can see this recipe will make 8 rock buns, and they can fit nicely onto a large baking tray. What's really good about this recipe is you can be ever so creative with it. So you can change the ingredients slightly, as I suggested earlier. Apple, other dried fruit, apricots work really well. You could add chocolate chips if you really wanted to. I suppose you could change the flour, and you could add wholemeal flour and make them a little bit healthier to increase more fibre. You could add a bit of cocoa powder and see if they would work coming out as chocolate. Or I have seen these where people make like a dent in the middle and then they put a blob of jam in there, which really is quite interesting. You have to be a bit careful because the jam does get very hot when you cook it. So they're going to go in the relatively hot oven that I mentioned earlier with the temperature, and they're going to go in for approximately, I think, between 10 and 15 minutes. So I will look at them after 10 minutes and they should go a bit golden brown. Okay, so you can see the rock buns have got a lovely nice golden colour. Okay, and they're relatively soft in the middle. You don't want them to be too dry in the middle. If you overcook them, they will be. So just be really careful going in and out of the oven. You know at school we've taught you about how to use oven gloves, so make sure you're using oven gloves safely to move. Not using a tea towel, it might be damp and you're more likely to burn yourself. Okay, so we can lift those onto your cooling rack, give them a few minutes to cool down. Remember, the raisins are quite high in sugar, so they will be very hot, so avoid touching those. You can always use a knife to help you lift them off, but I'm just gonna simply lift them off the baking tray, not using a knife to save my washing up. Talking about washing up, can we make sure that we are washing and cleaning down the kitchens? It's not fair on your parents if they're having to clean up after you, so make sure you get into really good habits of cleaning and tidying. So I hope you enjoy that recipe. I'm going to do another recipe which is using a similar method, the rubbing in method, and it's to make a very simple scone based pizza.